Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. Goodbye Tudor England, the end of an era. The Stuart dynasty is one that immediately followed the Tudors, and it is a period in English history that witnessed some of the most monumental changes. There was a civil war, a rebellion, a beheading of a king, Charles I, multiple plague outbreaks, a successful foreign invasion, the Great Fire of London, the Gunpowder Plot, and 7 monarchs. But the transition from Tudor to Stuart was initially one that thought would never happen, considering that Henry VIII banned the Stuart bloodline from taking the throne, and the 45 years in which Queen Elizabeth I was queen was watched with willing eyes for an heir the country so desperately wanted. All eyes were on the Queen in her dying moments, as she named her successor. But why did she choose the King of Scotland to essentially unite the Anglos and the Scots and lead the two nations under the Union flag? The Tudor dynasty started with the union of the Yorkists and the Lancastrians, when Henry VII married Elizabeth of York in 1486, having previously been crowned king on October 30th, 1485. Together they had 5 children, with only 3 surviving to adulthood, and those 3 were Henry, later Henry VIII, Mary, later the Queen of France, and Margaret, later the Queen of Scotland. It was through Henry VIII and his second wife Anne Boleyn, and then Margaret Tudor's son, James V of Scotland, that 2 monarchs were born, Elizabeth I to the English and Mary Queen of Scots to the Scottish. It was Mary's son, James VI, who would go on to take the mantle from the brilliant Queen Elizabeth and begin the Stuart dynasty, one that lasted 111 years. Not a considerably long time, especially when you think that there were 7 monarchs. An interesting fact is that, although Elizabeth died in 1603, a secret correspondence with James VI and an English minister, Sir Robert Cecil, took place in 1601. James was being prepared for a smooth succession to the English throne. When Elizabeth I came onto the throne in 1558, there was great apprehension regarding her ascension. Previously, Mary I had restored England to Catholicism, and there was great unease across the country with regards to religion. When Elizabeth became queen, the focus was who the new queen would marry and who she would have children with to secure the future of the Tudor dynasty. It was every duty of a monarch to secure their family on the throne in the event of their death. But this is something that Elizabeth did not do, and she became the last Tudor monarch. There were many possible suitors for the queen to marry, and many thought that she would take a husband to help her rule over the country. But this was never the case. The most prominent man she was linked with was the Earl of Leicester, Robert Dudley, who it's clear was the Queen's favourite. However, he was a married man, and following the mysterious death of his wife, Amy Robsart, Elizabeth was advised against a match with him. Dudley later offended the Queen greatly, as he also married one of her favourite ladies, Lettice Knollys, and Knollys was banished from the court for the rest of her life because of this match. But with every new possible suitor for the Queen came another reason for her not to marry. She had a number of reasons against marrying, but it is clear that she believed that she was sent by God to rule, and that she in fact was married to her duties of ruling over England. The issue with this was that there was no successor by the time she passed away in 1603. And every princess would have initially been prepared to have children to continue their bloodline. But with Elizabeth passing, the Tudor era came to an abrupt but sad end. Elizabeth I being childless then meant that the throne was forced to go elsewhere and to a different ruling family. Edward VI had previously tried to subvert the line of succession, changing it in which Lady Jane Grey would have been his successor. And if this would have been more successful than the 9-day reign was, then it's likely that the Tudor family could still be on the throne today, with her heirs taking the crown. But with Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, there was no one left for her to turn to. During her reign, she had seen a number of threats to her throne, which resulted in the execution of one of her cousins and a woman regarded as her possible successor. Mary, Queen of Scots, was of royal blood, and was the one which was seen by the Catholics as the rightful heir, with them deeming Elizabeth to have been a usurper. Mary was involved and implicated in a number of plots to assassinate Elizabeth and take the throne for herself, but as the plots thickened and became more serious, Elizabeth ordered her execution. By killing Mary, Queen of Scots, this made the issue of who would succeed the Queen even trickier. Mary had been in England for decades, albeit imprisoned inside various castles, and if she would have become Queen, she would have been popular with the Catholics. But in Scotland, Mary had been forced off her own throne, and because of this, her young son James was placed onto that throne. But both Mary and James belonged to the House of Stuart, and it was decreed during the reign of King Henry VIII that no Stuart heir would become a King of England. The Stuarts were ultimately banned from the throne by the father of Elizabeth I, and only decades before, during the reign of King Henry, the Scots and the English were at war with each other in devastating battles such as the Battle of Flodden. But as Elizabeth's death approached, it was clear that the old and anarchic decree by Henry VIII needed to be changed to sort the problem of the succession out. James was the great-great-grandson of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, and these links to the Tudor line also made him the closest living relative to Elizabeth at the time, and this gave him the strongest claim after her. Even after the law created by Henry VIII banning the Stuarts from the throne, there were no other candidates suitable. So an Ascension Council met, and James was proclaimed the King of England. Now, James was a lifelong Protestant, and this is potentially another reason why Elizabeth's mostly Protestant Privy Council immediately wrote to James and offered him the crown. It's also thought that James saw himself as a peacemaker, and the Catholic population of England felt that although being Protestant himself, that James would end their persecutions and allow them to worship freely. James settled his affairs in Scotland, but an outbreak of the plague in London meant that his entrance to the city was postponed until the 25th of July, a good 4 months after the death of the late Queen of England. It's believed that James had appealed to the English through the fact that he was Protestant, and unlike his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, who was a devout Catholic, James was sophisticated and believed that his belief needed to be argued to dismiss the opposition. Now, one major difference between James and Elizabeth upon his ascension to the throne is that James had children, heirs that could carry on his bloodline, and this, after nearly half a century with no certain future for the crown, was greeted with great pleasure. James and his wife, Anne of Denmark, were crowned King and Queen Consort at Westminster Abbey on the 25th of July 1603, and James was seated upon the Stone of Destiny. Now, although Scotland and England now shared a monarch, they would in fact remain separate states until 1707, when the Acts of Union dissolved the Scottish Parliament and merged the two nations to create the single kingdom of Great Britain. But interestingly, James had promised on his ascension to the English throne to return to Scotland every 3 years, but he only ever returned once in the 22 years until his death. The Stuarts and their successors had at last found a real kingdom to govern, and there are few future monarchs who would be over-concerned with the affairs of Scotland. In 1605, James was the subject of an assassination attempt, also known as the Gunpowder Plot, by the Catholics, but despite this, James steered a course of relative religious tolerance in England. Now, even though in the last year of Elizabeth's life it had become obvious that there could only be one successor, she almost to her very last breath refused to name James as her heir. You see, Elizabeth understood that by naming her heir, she was allowing her subjects to entirely neglect her, as she was admitting the end was near. If she had named James sooner, all would have rushed to worship him, even whilst the Queen was still alive. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.